9-year-old girl answered the door. She had already watched her father fall to the floor. She had already heard the shot. And according to trial testimony, she looked at the woman standing over her. And she begged. She said, "Please don't shoot me. I didn't do anything." The woman shot her anyway. Right now, across the United States, there are women sitting in prison cells, waiting for the state to end their lives. Some have been waiting for over 35 years. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, fewer than 2% of all death row inmates in the United States are women. That number is small. What those women did is not. In this documentary, you are going to learn the full story of 7 women, currently sitting on death row, across 5 American states. Their crimes were not impulsive. They were not accidents. Court records, trial testimony, and official prison documentation reveal something far more disturbing than most people expect. But there is one detail buried inside the case files of one of these women. A detail that investigators themselves described as unlike anything they had encountered. That will not surface until later in this documentary. And there is a second thread running through these cases. A pattern that connects women who never knew each other, who committed crimes thousands of miles apart, who were convicted in different decades. What that pattern reveals about the American justice system is something most people watching this have never been told. You might think that the most dangerous person in any of these cases was the man standing beside her. After all, in several of these crimes, there was a male co-defendant, a partner, an accomplice, a boyfriend. But according to court records and the findings of multiple juries, in case after case, it was the woman who planned it. It was the woman who drove it forward. And in more than one instance, it was the woman who made sure it was finished. 7 women, 7 complete stories, each one documented, each one verified, each one ending in the same sentence: death.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Her name was Cynthia Coffman. And before she became one of the most notorious women on death row in the United States, she was a young mother from St. Louis, Missouri who, by every account, appeared completely ordinary. Cynthia Lynn Coffman was born on January 19, 1962. She grew up in Missouri. Those who knew her in her early years described her as quiet, unremarkable, a girl who blended into the background without drawing attention to herself. But underneath that surface, according to court records and background documentation entered at trial, Coffman's early life carried significant instability. She moved through relationships quickly. She had a son from a prior relationship at a young age. And by her mid-20s, she was drifting, without a fixed direction, without a stable support structure, and without, investigators would later suggest, any meaningful anchor to the life she was trying to build. That instability made her vulnerable. And in 1986, it brought her directly into the path of a man who would change the course of her life, and end the lives of 4 young women who never had any reason to fear either of them. His name was James Gregory Marlowe. He went by the nickname the Folsom Wolf. He was a convicted felon with a documented history of violence, a man who had already moved through the California prison system before he encountered Cynthia Coffman. According to trial testimony and investigative records, the two met and formed a relationship that escalated rapidly. Those who observed them described a dynamic in which Coffman appeared increasingly under Marlowe's influence. But what the courts would ultimately find, and what 2 separate juries would confirm, was that Cynthia Coffman was not simply a passive participant in what came next. She was present. She was active. And in the eyes of the law, she was equally responsible for every single thing that followed. What came next was a killing spree that stretched across California and into Arizona and left 4 young women dead. The first victim was Karina Novis. She was 20 years old. According to court records, Novis was abducted from a laundromat in Redlands, California in October of 1986. She was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Her body was found in a sleeping bag in a vineyard in Rancho Cucamonga. Investigators documented the scene carefully. The manner of death was ligature strangulation. The evidence recovered at that scene connected directly to both Coffman and Marlowe. And this was only the beginning. The second victim was Lionel Murray. She was 24 years old. Murray was abducted from a laundromat in Fontana, California in November of 1986. According to testimony presented at trial, she was kidnapped, raped, and strangled. Her body was found in a sleeping bag near Big Bear Lake. Investigators noted the similarities between the 2 crime scenes immediately. The methodology was consistent. The locations formed a pattern. And the physical evidence once again pointed back to the same 2 people moving through Southern California with a purpose that was becoming impossible to ignore. The third victim was Sandra Neary. She was 31 years old. Neary was abducted in California in November of 1986. She was strangled. Her body was recovered, and the physical evidence collected at the scene was added to a growing body of documentation that investigators were now treating as a single connected series of crimes. A deliberate, mobile killing operation. 4 women. The same method. The same 2 suspects. And not a single one of those women had done anything other than be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The 4th victim was Pamela Simmons. Abducted. Strangled. Her case prosecuted directly against Cynthia Coffman in the California courts. 4 women dead within the span of weeks. 4 families destroyed. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Cynthia Coffman had been there for every single one. If this story is already sitting heavy with you, stay with it, because what the courts uncovered next is the part that most people never hear about. Coffman and Marlowe were arrested in November of 1986 in Arizona. According to investigative records, they were taken into custody without significant resistance. What followed their arrest was one of the most legally complex proceedings in California death penalty history. Because the crimes had occurred across multiple jurisdictions, both defendants faced prosecution in more than one state. And because of that complexity, the legal process that would ultimately determine Cynthia Coffman's fate took years to fully resolve. In California, Coffman was tried separately from James Marlowe. That decision was deliberate. Prosecutors wanted each defendant evaluated on their own actions, their own choices, their own documented role in what had happened to those 4 women. The jury did not struggle. According to court records, Coffman was convicted of the first-degree murder of Karina Novis. The special circumstances required for a death sentence were found: kidnapping, rape, and murder committed in combination. The sentence handed down was death. She was also prosecuted in connection with the deaths of the other victims. In Arizona, additional charges were filed. The legal proceedings stretched across multiple courts, multiple states, and multiple years. But the outcome in each jurisdiction told the same story. Cynthia Coffman had been an active participant in the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of 4 young women. And the courts of 2 American states had decided that the appropriate consequence for that was execution. Coffman arrived on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. According to official prison documentation, she was classified at the highest security level available for female inmates in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The Central California Women's Facility houses the entirety of California's female death row population. It is the only state prison in California where women sentenced to death are held. Coffman was assigned to the condemned unit. Conditions in that unit, according to prison documentation and reporting by investigative journalists who have covered the facility, involve significant isolation. Death row inmates at Chowchilla spend the majority of their time in their cells. Movement is restricted. Interaction with the general population is limited. The daily reality of life in that unit is one of long stretches of confinement interrupted by brief, controlled periods of activity. According to documented records and reporting on her case over the years, Coffman has maintained a presence on death row that has drawn periodic attention. She has filed multiple legal appeals challenging her conviction and her sentence. Those appeals have addressed issues ranging from the conduct of her original trial to the constitutionality of her death sentence. As of the time this documentary was produced, none of those appeals had succeeded in overturning either her conviction or her sentence. She remains on death row. She has been there for over 35 years. California has not carried out an execution since 2006, and a moratorium on executions has been in place in the state since 2019. What that means in practical terms is that Cynthia Coffman sits in a cell at Chowchilla, sentenced to die, in a state that has not executed anyone in nearly 2 decades. The 4 women she was convicted of helping to kill were 20 years old, 24 years old, 31 years old, and gone before any of them had lived the full lives that were still ahead of them. Karina Novis, Lionel Murray, Sandra Neary, Pamela Simmons. Their names are in the court records. Their cases built the legal foundation that put Cynthia Coffman on death row. And their families have lived with the outcome of those weeks in 1986 for every year since. Cynthia Coffman has lived with it too, in a cell, under sentence of death, in a state that cannot decide whether it will ever carry that sentence out. That is the story of Cynthia Coffman. But inside the walls of America's death rows, another case was already unfolding, one that began not in the darkness of a parking lot or a remote vineyard, but on a college campus, in broad daylight, carried out by someone who had not yet turned 19 years old. What that case revealed about cruelty, about youth, and about what a human being is capable of planning in cold blood, is something that even seasoned investigators who worked the case said they were not prepared for. The story you just heard began with a drifting young woman who fell into the orbit of a violent man and made choices that ended 4 lives. The story you are about to hear is different. There was no older man pulling the strings. There was no history of drifting or instability that investigators could point to as an obvious warning sign. There was a college campus. There was a classmate. And there was a level of deliberate, sustained cruelty that caused the judge who sentenced her to describe what she had done as one of the most brutal acts he had ever encountered in a courtroom. Her name was Christa Pike. And when the state of Tennessee sentenced her to death, she was 18 years old, making her the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States of America. Christa Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in West Virginia. Her early life, according to background documentation and records referenced in court proceedings, was marked by instability and difficult family circumstances. She moved frequently during her childhood. Her home environment was described by those who knew her as chaotic. By her mid-teens, Pike had already begun accumulating a personal history that those around her found concerning. She was described by people who knew her during this period as someone who could be intensely manipulative, someone who sought control in her relationships, and someone whose emotional responses were difficult to predict. By the time she was 17 years old, Christa Pike had enrolled in the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee. Job Corps is a federally funded education and vocational training program designed to help young people between the ages of 16 and 24 gain the skills they need to enter the workforce. The Knoxville campus housed hundreds of young people living and studying together in a structured residential environment. It was, by design, a second chance, a program built around the idea that young people in difficult circumstances could be redirected towards stable, productive lives. For most of the people on that campus, it worked. For Colleen Slemmer, it ended in her death. And for Christa Pike, it ended on death row. Colleen Slemmer was also a student at the Knoxville Job Corps campus. She was 19 years old. According to court records and testimony presented at trial, Pike and Slemmer had a conflict that centered around a young man named Tadrell Shipp, with whom Pike was in a relationship. Pike believed that Slemmer was interested in Shipp and viewed her as a rival. What began as the kind of interpersonal tension that exists on any residential campus escalated, according to the evidence, into something far more deliberate and far more violent than anyone around them appears to have anticipated. According to court records and testimony, in January of 1995, Christa Pike, along with Tadrell Shipp and a third individual named Shawna Peterson, lured Colleen Slemmer away from the Job Corps campus to a secluded area on the University of Tennessee Agricultural campus nearby. What happened in that location over the next period of time was documented in detail during the trial and described by prosecutors as an act of extended, deliberate torture. According to testimony, Slemmer was beaten. She was struck repeatedly over a period that witnesses and forensic evidence suggested lasted approximately 30 minutes. She was cut with a box cutter. According to testimony, Pike used a piece of asphalt to strike Slemmer in the head with significant force. And according to the evidence presented at trial, when Colleen Slemmer was dead, Christa Pike removed a piece of her skull. She kept it. According to testimony, she showed it to other people afterward. She described what she had done. And according to witnesses, she expressed no remorse. The piece of Colleen Slemmer's skull was later recovered. It was entered into evidence. It became one of the most disturbing documented facts in a case that was already almost impossible to process. A 19-year-old woman had been beaten, tortured, and killed over a romantic rivalry. And the person who had driven every stage of that killing had kept a piece of her as a trophy. Christa Pike was 18 years old when it happened. The investigation moved quickly. According to court records, Pike, Shipp, and Peterson were identified and arrested within a short period of the murder. The physical evidence was substantial. The testimony of witnesses who had heard Pike describe what she had done was documented and presented to the jury. The piece of Slemmer's skull, recovered from Pike's possession, connected her directly and irrefutably to the crime. The case against Christa Pike was, according to the legal record, not a close one. Pike was tried as an adult. The decision to try her as an adult reflected the nature and severity of the crime. She was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury deliberated and returned a sentence of death. Tadrell Shipp was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Shawna Peterson pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and received a lighter sentence. But it was Christa Pike who the jury determined had driven the crime, sustained the violence, and carried out the act of killing with a level of deliberateness and cruelty that warranted the ultimate sentence. At 18 years old, Christa Gale Pike became the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. That record still stands. Pike was transferred to the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville, where she has been held on death row. The Tennessee Prison for Women is a multi-custody facility that houses inmates at various security levels, including the state's female death row population. Life on death row at that facility, according to prison documentation and reporting on conditions there, involves significant restrictions on movement and interaction. Death row inmates are housed separately from the general population. Time outside the cell is limited and controlled. The daily structure is designed around security and containment rather than rehabilitation. For an 18-year-old arriving into that environment, the transition was absolute. The world she had known, chaotic and unstable as it was replaced by a world defined entirely by walls, locks, and the permanent knowledge of what was waiting at the end of her appeals. And Christa Pike has not spent those years quietly. According to documented records, while incarcerated at the Tennessee Prison for Women, Pike was involved in an additional attempted murder. In 2001, according to court records, Pike and another inmate attempted to strangle a fellow prisoner. Pike was convicted of that attempted murder in 2012 and received an additional life sentence. The attack had been planned. The method was deliberate. And the conviction added another layer of documented violence to a record that had begun at 18 years old on a secluded piece of ground near the University of Tennessee campus. The attempted murder conviction drew significant attention to Pike's case and raised serious questions about the management of a condemned inmate who had demonstrated a continued willingness to commit violence even from inside a maximum security facility. According to court documentation from the 2012 proceedings, the attack on the fellow prisoner had been premeditated. Pike had not simply acted impulsively in a moment of conflict. She had, according to the evidence, planned it. The pattern established in January of 1995, deliberate, sustained, planned violence, had not ended with her arrest or her conviction or her sentence. It had continued inside the walls of the facility that was supposed to contain her. Pike has also attracted attention for other reasons during her time on death row. According to documented reports, she has received significant correspondence and attention from individuals outside the prison who have developed an interest in her case, a phenomenon that occurs with some death row inmates and that prison authorities have had to manage over the years. She has participated in interviews. She has maintained a presence in the public consciousness around her case in ways that most death row inmates do not. Whether that reflects a continued desire for control and attention or something else is a matter for those who have studied her case professionally. What the documented record shows is that Christa Pike, now in her late 40s, remains on death row in Tennessee, under a death sentence that has been subject to ongoing legal appeals. Those appeals have addressed multiple aspects of her conviction and sentence. Issues raised have included questions about her mental state at the time of the crime, her age at sentencing, and the broader constitutional questions around executing someone who was 18 years old at the time of their offense, questions that the United States Supreme Court has addressed in related cases involving juvenile offenders, though Pike's specific situation has its own legal complexities given that she was legally an adult at 18. As of the time this documentary was produced, no appeal had succeeded in overturning her conviction or her death sentence. She remains the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. And Colleen Slemmer, who was 19 years old and enrolled in a program designed to give young people a better future, has been dead since January of 1995. The documented facts of this case sit in the record of the Knox County courts, in the files of the Tennessee Department of Correction, and in the testimony of the people who were on that campus and who knew both of these young women. Colleen Slemmer did not have a chance to grow into an adult life. Christa Pike was given 30 years on death row to do exactly that. What those 30 years have produced, according to the documented record, is an additional conviction for attempted murder, ongoing appeals, and a file that keeps getting thicker while a 19-year-old story ended permanently in January of 1995 in a field outside Knoxville, Tennessee. That is the story of Christa Pike. But the cases in this documentary do not get easier from here. The next woman you are about to hear about did not act in a moment of jealous rage. She did not attach herself to a violent partner and drift into something catastrophic. What she participated in on a single night in Lexington, Kentucky, was a series of killings so methodical, so sustained, and so brutal in their execution that investigators and prosecutors struggled to find language adequate to describe what had happened. 5 people died that night. One of them was 14 years old. And the woman at the center of it was someone who, by the time it was over, had earned a place in the documented history of American violent crime that she has never been able to leave behind. What you have heard so far in this documentary involves women who killed with a partner, women who killed out of jealousy, women who killed for control. The next case is different in almost every way that matters. There was no single victim. There was no single location. There was no single method. What happened in Lexington, Kentucky on the night of January 13, 1986 was a sustained, mobile series of killings that moved through multiple locations in a single evening and left 5 people dead before it was over. One of those people was a 14-year-old boy. And the woman at the center of it, convicted, sentenced to death, and still sitting on Kentucky's death row nearly 4 decades later, is a woman named Lafonda Foster. Lafonda Foster was born in 1962 in Kentucky. According to background records and documentation referenced in court proceedings, her early life was shaped by poverty, instability, and an environment that provided little in the way of structure or protection. Those who knew her during her childhood described circumstances that were difficult by any measure. She moved through her teenage years and into her early 20s without accumulating the kind of stable foundation that might have redirected what came next. By January of 1986, Foster was 23 years old, living in Lexington, Kentucky, and connected to a group of individuals whose collective capacity for violence would become documented fact before that month was over. The events of January 13, 1986 unfolded over the course of a single night. According to court records, testimony, and the findings of the Kentucky courts that prosecuted the case, Lafonda Foster participated alongside a co-defendant named Tina Powell in a series of attacks that moved through Lexington targeting multiple victims. The prosecution's case, as documented in court records, established that the killings were not spontaneous eruptions of violence but rather a sustained series of attacks carried out with enough deliberateness to connect them as a single criminal event. 5 people died that night. The methods used against them included stabbing, beating, and burning. The forensic documentation of what was done to those 5 people was described by investigators and prosecutors as among the most disturbing they had encountered in their careers. The victims were Carlos Identify Wigglesworth, age 26. Contributor Carlos Identify Wigglesworth, age 26. Raymond Wigglesworth. William Sample. Fred Connor. And a 14-year-old boy named Monte Bayless. 5 people. 5 separate human beings with lives and families and futures that ended on a single night in January because they encountered Lafonda Foster and her co-defendant. According to court records, the victims were attacked in their homes and in locations around Lexington. They were stabbed. They were beaten. And according to the documented findings of investigators, at least some of the victims were set on fire. The use of fire in the commission of these killings was treated by prosecutors as a significant aggravating factor, an act that went beyond killing and into something that investigators described as an attempt to destroy evidence and inflict additional violation upon the victims even after death. The 14-year-old boy, Monte Bayless, was among those who died that night. The documented fact of a child's death in the middle of this series of killings, a child who had no documented connection to whatever conflict or motivation had driven the events of that evening, became one of the central elements of the prosecution's case for the death penalty. The killing of a child, combined with the killing of multiple victims, combined with the use of fire, gave prosecutors a substantial aggravating circumstance case that the jury ultimately accepted. The investigation that followed the killings moved through the evidence carefully. According to court records, Foster and Powell were identified, arrested, and charged with multiple counts of murder. The physical evidence was substantial. The witness testimony was documented. And the legal proceedings that followed were among the most significant capital punishment cases in Kentucky history, not only because of the severity of the crimes but because of what they would eventually reveal about how Kentucky handles its female death row population, a population so small that the state has faced significant institutional questions about where and how to house it. Foster was convicted of 5 counts of murder. The jury found the aggravating circumstances necessary for a death sentence. She was sentenced to death. Tina Powell was also convicted and sentenced to death, though Powell's sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment following additional legal proceedings. Lafonda Foster's death sentence was not commuted. She has remained on death row in Kentucky ever since. And here is where the story of Lafonda Foster becomes something larger than one woman's case. Because what her continued presence on Kentucky's death row has exposed, documented through legal filings, investigative reporting, and official state records, is a set of conditions that have drawn sustained scrutiny from legal advocates, journalists, and civil rights organizations for years. Kentucky's female death row population has historically been extremely small. At various points, Foster has been the only woman on death row in the entire state. And that singular status has produced a documented set of conditions that her legal advocates have described in court filings as punishing in ways that go beyond the sentence itself. According to legal filings and reporting on her case, Foster has spent extended periods in conditions of near-total isolation. When you are the only condemned woman in a state's prison system, the institutional structures built for larger populations do not apply to you. There is no death row unit with other condemned women nearby. There is no cohort of people in the same legal situation with whom any kind of daily existence can be shared. There is, according to the documentation, a cell, and time, and a legal process that has moved with the particular slowness that characterizes capital cases in states that rarely execute anyone. Kentucky carried out its last execution in 2008. The state has a small death row population and a legal and political environment around capital punishment that has produced long delays between sentence and execution for virtually everyone on death row there. For Lafonda Foster, that has meant nearly 4 decades in a system that sentenced her to die and has not yet carried that sentence out. The psychological dimensions of that reality, documented through legal filings that have raised conditions of confinement challenges on her behalf, have been described by mental health professionals who have evaluated her as profoundly damaging. Extended isolation, the documentation suggests, does not simply pass without effect. It accumulates. It changes the cognitive and emotional architecture of the person experiencing it in ways that are documented in the medical and psychological literature on solitary and near-solitary confinement. The legal arguments made on Foster's behalf have pointed to this documented body of evidence and argued that the conditions of her confinement constitute a punishment that goes beyond what any court sentenced her to. Those arguments have not succeeded in changing her sentence. But they are part of the documented record of her case, and they illuminate something about the American death row system that goes beyond any individual inmate's story. What the documented record of Lafonda Foster's case reveals, and what makes it an example of a broader systemic truth that runs through this documentary, is that the death row experience in the United States is not uniform. It is not a single defined condition applied consistently to everyone sentenced to die. It is a collection of state systems, each with its own population size, its own facility infrastructure, its own pace of legal proceedings, and its own capacity to handle edge cases like a woman who is the only condemned female inmate in the entire state. The gap between what those systems were designed to manage and what they actually produce for individual inmates is documented in legal filings, civil rights organization reports, and official audit findings across multiple states. Lafonda Foster's case is one of the clearest examples in the documented record of what happens when a system built for volume encounters an individual it was not designed to hold. And if that feels like the kind of detail that should be more widely known, you are not wrong, because the cases you are about to hear next show the same pattern operating in different states, with different women, producing the same documented outcomes. Foster has filed legal appeals over the decades addressing her conviction, her sentence, and the conditions of her confinement. As of the time this documentary was produced, none of those appeals had succeeded in overturning her conviction or her death sentence. She remains on death row in Kentucky. She has been there since 1986. She was 23 years old when she participated in the killings of 5 people on a single night in Lexington. She is now in her early 60s. The 5 people who died that night, including a 14-year-old boy named Monta Bayless, have been dead for nearly 40 years. Their families have lived with that reality every single day. Lafonda Foster has lived with it too, in a cell, in conditions that the documented record describes as among the most isolating in the American death row system, waiting for a state that sentenced her to die to decide whether it will ever follow through. If you have watched this far, do not stop now. The next 2 cases in this documentary involve crimes that were not committed in a single night of violence but were planned, prepared, and carried out with a level of cold calculation that the investigators who worked them still talk about today. The first of those 2 women walked into a house and set it on fire while her husband and 2 young children were sleeping inside. The second, dressed as a law enforcement officer, knocked on a family's door and shot a 9-year-old girl after the child begged for her life. Both of those women are still alive. Both of them are on death row. And both of their stories are documented in full in what comes next. She arrived in Boise, Idaho with 2 children and $2. That was it. According to court records and documented accounts presented at trial, Robin Lee Rowe stepped off a bus in August of 1987 with her son Joshua and her daughter Tabitha. No plan, no contacts, and almost nothing to her name. She had fled California under circumstances that investigators would later describe as deeply suspicious. There were allegations of fraud already forming behind her. She had not chosen Boise, she later said she had barely heard of it. But Boise took her in. Charitable organizations helped her find housing. The YWCA provided employment. And within a year, Robin Lee Rowe had rebuilt herself into something that looked, from the outside, entirely respectable. She was born Robin Lee Christensen in 1956, and according to those who knew her in her early years, she was charming, quick, and socially capable in ways that made her easy to trust. She moved through relationships and living situations with a restlessness that people around her often attributed to hard luck rather than design. She married multiple times. She accumulated debt. And according to investigators who later reconstructed her financial history, she had developed a pattern, a very specific, very deliberate pattern, of taking out life insurance policies on the people closest to her before those people died or disappeared. The first suspicious death connected to Robin Lee Rowe occurred before she ever arrived in Idaho. According to investigative accounts, a boyfriend in California died under circumstances that at the time were attributed to natural causes. Rowe had insured him. She collected. The death was not investigated as a homicide at the time, and Rowe faced no charges. She moved on. She remarried. She had children. And when that marriage collapsed and she found herself on a bus to Boise with $2 in her pocket, the pattern she had already established was not finished. It was waiting for the right conditions to continue. In Boise, she met Randy Rowe. According to court testimony, Randy was a kind man, a stable man, the kind of man who believed in second chances and who saw in Robin and her 2 children something worth helping. They married in 1990. Randy adopted Joshua and Tabitha, giving them his name. From the outside, the family looked like a success story. From the inside, according to the financial records prosecutors would later present in court, Robin Lee Rowe had already begun building the architecture of their deaths. Between 1990 and early 1992, according to court records, Robin Rowe took out multiple life insurance policies on Randy, on Joshua, and on Tabitha. The total value of those policies exceeded $176,000. She insured her husband. She insured her 8-year-old son. She insured her 10-year-old daughter. And then, according to the prosecution's case, she waited. On the night of February 10, 1992, a fire broke out at the Rowe family home at 3734 Denago Street in Boise. Randy Rowe, Joshua Rowe aged 8, and Tabitha Rowe aged 10 were inside. According to fire investigators, the blaze was not accidental. The investigation determined that the fire had been deliberately set. Randy, Joshua, and Tabitha did not survive. Robin Lee Rowe was not in the house when the fire started. She had left earlier that evening. According to witnesses, she had made sure to be somewhere else. What happened in the immediate aftermath of the fire is documented in court records with a clinical precision that investigators described as deeply disturbing. Robin Lee Rowe did not present as a grieving widow and mother. According to testimony from people who encountered her in the hours after the deaths of her husband and 2 children, her demeanor was composed, controlled, almost administrative. Within days, according to court records, she had begun the process of filing insurance claims. She filed against every policy. She filed for the full amounts. The total she sought to collect exceeded $176,000, the price she had calculated for the lives of Randy, Joshua, and Tabitha Rowe. Idaho investigators were suspicious from the beginning. The fire marshal's report concluded the fire had been deliberately set. Financial records subpoenaed during the investigation revealed the full extent of the insurance portfolio Rowe had assembled. The pattern from California was identified. Prosecutors built a case that presented Robin Lee Rowe not as a woman destroyed by tragedy but as a woman who had engineered tragedy as a financial transaction. She was charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of all 3 family members. She was convicted on all counts. And in 1993, Robin Lee Rowe was sentenced to death. She was sent to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Boise, the same city where she had burned her family alive. According to Idaho Department of Correction records, she was placed in the Women's Death Row Unit, a facility that houses a very small condemned female population. Robin Lee Rowe has now spent over 30 years on death row in Idaho. She has filed multiple appeals over the decades, challenging her conviction and her sentence on various grounds. As of the time of this documentary, all appeals have been denied. Her execution has not been scheduled. She remains on death row, in the same city, within miles of where Randy, Joshua, and Tabitha Rowe died on the night of February 10, 1992. What the documented record of Robin Lee Rowe's case reveals is something that prosecutors described at trial as premeditated murder in its most calculated form, not a crime of passion, not a moment of catastrophic judgment, but a financial plan that required the deaths of 3 people including 2 children to reach its conclusion. The insurance companies never paid out. Robin Lee Rowe never collected a dollar. The $176,000 she had spent years engineering never came. What she had instead was 3 counts of first-degree murder, a death sentence, and a cell in Boise, Idaho, that she has not left in over 3 decades. That was the story of Robin Lee Rowe. But inside the American prison system, another case was building, one that began not inside a house but on a border, inside a movement, and inside the mind of a woman who had convinced herself that what she was doing was not murder but mission. Shawna Forde was born in 1969 in Everett, Washington, and according to court records and documented biographical accounts, her early life was fractured from the beginning. She was given up for adoption as an infant. The adoptive family she grew up in was, by multiple accounts, deeply unstable. According to documentation presented in legal proceedings, Forde experienced neglect and abuse during her childhood, and she began accumulating a criminal record as a young adult that included convictions for theft, prostitution, and other offenses. She married multiple times. She had children. And by her mid-30s, she had found something that gave her a sense of identity and purpose that her fractured personal life had never provided: the American Border Vigilante movement. By the mid-2000s, Shawna Forde had positioned herself as a prominent figure in the Minutemen movement, a loosely organized network of citizens who claimed their mission was to monitor and patrol the United States-Mexico border in Arizona. According to investigative journalism and court documents, Forde was not simply a rank-and-file member. She cultivated a public profile. She gave interviews. She described herself as a border security activist. She founded her own splinter organization, Minutemen American Defense, known as MAD, after developing conflicts with the leadership of larger Minutemen groups. And according to federal investigators and trial testimony, behind the public activism was something far darker: a plan to fund the organization's operations through armed robbery, and a target already selected. According to trial testimony and court records, by early 2009 Forde had identified a man named Raul Flores in the small Arizona community of Arivaca as a suspected drug dealer. Her plan, as described by co-conspirators in court testimony, was to conduct an armed home invasion at the Flores residence, steal drugs and cash, and use the proceeds to fund Minutemen American Defense operations. According to testimony, Forde recruited 2 men, Jason Bush, a convicted felon with a violent history, and Albert Gaxiola, to carry out the operation with her. The plan included impersonating law enforcement officers to gain entry to the home. In the early hours of May 30, 2009, Shawna Forde, Jason Bush, and Albert Gaxiola approached the home of Raul Flores on Mesquite Road in Arivaca, Arizona. According to trial testimony from Gina Gonzalez, Raul's wife and the sole adult survivor of what followed, the group knocked on the door and identified themselves as law enforcement. Raul Flores opened the door. What happened next is documented in the trial testimony of Gina Gonzalez, who described it to the jury in Pima County Superior Court in detail that multiple jurors and court observers described as among the most devastating testimony they had ever heard in a courtroom. According to Gonzalez's testimony, Jason Bush shot Raul Flores almost immediately after entering the home. Gonzalez herself was shot. Lying on the floor, bleeding, she pretended to be dead. And then, according to her testimony, she heard her 9-year-old daughter Brisenia wake up. Brisenia Flores had been asleep on the couch with her puppy. She woke to find strangers in her home and her parents on the floor. According to Gonzalez's testimony, Brisenia looked at the intruder and said, "Please don't shoot me." She was shot twice. At point-blank range. By Jason Bush, on the direction of Shawna Forde. Brisenia Flores was 9 years old. Gina Gonzalez survived. According to court records, she was able to reach a phone after the attackers left, called 911, and provided information that allowed investigators to identify the perpetrators. The 911 call, which was played in court, documented Gonzalez's account of the attack in real time. It became one of the central pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. Forde, Bush, and Gaxiola were arrested within weeks of the attack. According to investigators, the robbery had yielded almost nothing. There were no drugs. There was no significant cash. Raul Flores and his 9-year-old daughter had been killed for a plan that produced nothing except 2 bodies and a 911 call that dismantled the entire operation. The trial of Shawna Forde began in January 2011 in Pima County, Arizona. Gina Gonzalez testified. The 911 call was played for the jury. Co-conspirator testimony described Forde's role as the organizer and leader of the operation. According to court records, Forde attempted to present herself as uninvolved in the actual shootings, arguing that Jason Bush had acted beyond the scope of the plan. The jury rejected this entirely. Shawna Forde was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, for Raul Flores and for Brisenia Flores, as well as attempted first-degree murder for the attack on Gina Gonzalez, aggravated assault, armed robbery, and burglary. She was sentenced to death on both murder counts in March 2011. Forde was sent to the Arizona State Prison Complex Perryville in Goodyear, Arizona, which houses the state's female death row population. According to Arizona Department of Corrections records, she has been held there since her conviction. She has pursued multiple appeals, challenging her conviction and sentence on various grounds including claims related to jury selection and the conduct of her trial. As of the time of this documentary, her appeals have not succeeded. She remains on death row at Perryville. Brisenia Flores, who begged for her life at 9 years old, has been dead for over 15 years. Her father Raul has been dead for over 15 years. And Shawna Forde, who organized the operation that killed them both, sits in a cell in Goodyear, Arizona, filing legal briefs and waiting. What the documented record of Shawna Forde's case reveals is something that federal investigators and legal observers noted at the time of her trial as uniquely chilling, not simply the violence itself, but the ideological framework Forde had constructed around it. She had not acted in a moment of rage or desperation. She had planned, recruited, organized, and executed an operation that she believed was in service of a cause. The cause did not survive contact with what she actually did on Mesquite Road on the morning of May 30, 2009. The movement distanced itself from her immediately. The funding never materialized. The mission produced nothing except the death of a child who had done nothing except fall asleep on a couch with her puppy. In a moment we will turn to 2 more cases, 2 more women whose stories reveal a pattern of calculation and violence that the American justice system ultimately answered with the same sentence. But what you are about to hear next takes that pattern somewhere that even veteran prosecutors described as territory they had never encountered before. There is a version of the story of Emilia Carr that her defense attorneys presented to a Marion County jury in 2010, and it was a story about a woman who had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. It was a story about a childhood defined by documented abuse, a father convicted of soliciting the murders of his own family, a young woman who cycled through marriages and instability and crisis and who, by the time she was in her mid-20s, was pregnant and had been proposed to and abandoned by the same man within the span of a single month. That version of the story was true. Every documented element of it was true. And the jury heard it, considered it, and still voted 7-5 to sentence Emilia Carr to death. Because the other version of the story was also true. And the other version involved a chair, a garbage bag, and a woman named Heather Strong who had done nothing except try to leave a man who wanted her dead. Emilia Lily Carr was born in 1982 and grew up in circumstances that multiple court-appointed evaluators described as severely traumatic. According to documents presented at trial, when Carr was 15 years old she reported to her school that her father was sexually abusing her. She later withdrew the statement. In February 2004, her father was convicted of soliciting the murders of his own family, Emilia, her mother, and one of her sisters, and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Carr had married twice by her mid-20s, had filed a restraining order against one ex-husband for domestic violence, and had 3 children. She had been assessed by a psychologist who estimated her IQ at 125. She was, by documented accounts, intelligent, resourceful, and capable. She was also, by the time she met Joshua Fulgham, living inside a cycle of instability that had defined every significant relationship in her life. Joshua Damien Fulgham had been in an on-again off-again relationship with a woman named Heather Strong for over a decade. They had 2 children together. In November 2008, Fulgham proposed to Emilia Carr. Carr accepted. She was already pregnant with what she believed to be his child. 1 month later, Fulgham changed course entirely. He took back the ring and married Heather Strong instead. According to testimony from Carr's own mother, presented in court, Carr was devastated. According to witnesses, Fulgham had made the decision primarily because Strong had told him she intended to take their 2 children and move to Mississippi to be closer to her family, and Fulgham, unwilling to lose access to his children, had married her as a tactical maneuver to maintain custody leverage. Within weeks of the marriage, according to court records, Heather Strong was calling police. Fulgham was arrested for pointing a shotgun at her. He was held in the Marion County Jail. It was from that jail cell that the documented plan to murder Heather Strong began. According to phone records and recorded conversations presented at trial, Fulgham and Carr re-established contact while he was incarcerated. According to those records, Fulgham's intentions toward Strong were explicit and specific. The plan, as reconstructed by prosecutors from the documented evidence, involved luring Strong to a location under false pretenses, restraining her, forcing her to sign over custody of her children to Fulgham, and then killing her. Carr, who was approximately 7 months pregnant at the time of the murder, was present and active throughout. On February 15, 2009, Heather Strong disappeared. She had last been seen leaving work at an Iron Skillet restaurant near Interstate 75 in Reddick, Florida. She was reported missing by her cousin on February 24. By the time investigators began looking, the trail led directly and quickly to Joshua Fulgham and Emilia Carr. According to the prosecution's reconstruction of events, presented through trial testimony and physical evidence, Fulgham lured Strong to a storage trailer on property connected to Carr's family. When Strong arrived and attempted to leave, Fulgham struck her in the head with a flashlight. Carr and Fulgham then taped Strong to a chair. They forced her to sign a document transferring custody of her 2 children to Fulgham. And then, according to the evidence presented at trial, Carr placed a garbage bag over Heather Strong's head, and Fulgham held it in place and wrapped tape around Strong's neck until she stopped breathing. Heather Strong was 26 years old. Her body was found in a shallow grave near the storage trailer on March 19, 2009. Carr was arrested on March 24 after a recorded conversation with Fulgham's sister in which she admitted her participation in the killing. She had made 10 separate statements to investigators before her arrest, none of them in the presence of an attorney. She was 8 months pregnant when she was taken into custody. She gave birth to her 4th child while in custody at Marion County Jail in March of 2009. Fulgham directed investigators to the location of Strong's body on March 18 after initially claiming she had simply left him with custody of the children. Both Carr and Fulgham were charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. At trial, both the prosecution and the defense agreed on the motive, jealousy and betrayal. The jury convicted Emilia Carr of first-degree murder and kidnapping in December 2010 and voted 7-5 to recommend the death penalty. The judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Carr to death in February 2011, making her the first woman sentenced to death in Marion County since Eileen Wuornos in 1992. She was sent to Lowell Correctional Institution in Marion County. Joshua Fulgham was tried separately, convicted of the same charges, and sentenced to life in prison. He received the lesser sentence despite being the primary architect of the plan, a disparity that Carr's defense attorneys noted extensively in subsequent appeals. In 2016, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Hurst v. Florida that Florida's death sentencing scheme, which allowed a judge to impose death without a unanimous jury recommendation, was unconstitutional. The Florida Supreme Court subsequently required unanimous jury verdicts for death sentences. Because Carr's jury had voted 7-5 rather than unanimously, her sentence fell within the scope of the ruling. On May 19, 2017, Emilia Carr was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is currently held at Lowell Correctional Institution. Heather Strong's family had opposed the resentencing. Heather Strong's body was found in a field. Her children grew up without their mother. And the woman who held the bag over her head is alive, in a Florida prison, serving a sentence that will end only when she dies. That was the story of Emilia Carr. But inside the same system, in a different state entirely, a different kind of plan had been years in the making, documented in nearly 300 letters, 19 recorded phone calls, and a paper trail so thorough that investigators described it as one of the most completely documented murder conspiracies in the history of Ohio law enforcement. Donna Kay Roberts was born in 1944 in Youngstown, Ohio, and by the time she was in her 50s she had built, by multiple accounts, a life that looked entirely respectable from the outside. She and her partner Robert Fingerhut had managed an Avis car rental franchise at the Youngstown-Warren Regional Airport. They had managed Greyhound bus stations in both Youngstown and Warren and, according to court records, had turned them into successful operations. Roberts had even run a small restaurant inside the Youngstown bus terminal. She and Fingerhut had been married, then divorced, but continued living together in their home in Howland Township, Trumbull County, in what court documents described as an open domestic arrangement maintained primarily for business convenience. To the people around them, they were partners in the broadest sense, financially entwined, domestically entangled, and apparently stable. At some point during that arrangement, according to court records, Donna Roberts met a man named Nathaniel Jackson. Jackson was significantly younger than Roberts. He worked at a restaurant where Roberts was a regular presence. The relationship became an affair. And then, in 2001, Jackson was sent to prison on an unrelated charge. What happened next is documented in a body of evidence that prosecutors described as almost unprecedented in its volume and explicitness. While Jackson was incarcerated at the Lorraine Correctional Institution, he and Roberts exchanged what investigators ultimately recovered as nearly 300 letters and 19 recorded phone calls. In those letters and calls, according to the Ohio Supreme Court's documented review of the evidence, Jackson repeatedly and explicitly stated his intention to kill Robert Fingerhut upon his release from prison. Roberts, for her part, wrote back. According to court records, in one letter she instructed Jackson to do whatever you want to him as soon as possible. In another documented exchange, when Roberts expressed some hesitation, Jackson told her, "I got to do this, Donna. I got to. Just consider it a done deal." Roberts did more than correspond. According to court records, she actively prepared for the murder. She purchased a mask and gloves for Jackson to use during the killing. She arranged a hotel room. She allowed Jackson into the home she shared with Fingerhut and ensured she would not be present when Jackson carried out the plan. On December 9, 2001, 2 days after Jackson's release from prison, Roberts picked him up at the facility. They spent 2 days together at a motel. On the evening of December 11th, according to phone records entered into evidence, Roberts and Jackson were in near-constant phone contact between 9:45 and 11:45 in the evening. Roberts checked into a Days Inn in Boardman, Ohio. Jackson entered the home on Fond du Lac Drive in Howland Township. Robert Fingerhut was found on the kitchen floor with multiple gunshot wounds. At 12:01 in the morning on December 12, 2001, Donna Roberts called 911 and reported the death of her former husband. The investigation moved quickly. Investigators noted inconsistencies in Roberts' account immediately. She initially suggested to police that Fingerhut may have been killed by one of his male acquaintances, attempting to redirect the investigation. But the physical evidence was clear. Jackson's DNA was recovered at the scene, and the letters and phone records, recovered by investigators, dismantled any remaining doubt about Roberts' role. She was arrested on December 21, 2001. The nearly 300 letters and 19 phone calls were entered into evidence at trial. The jury convicted Roberts of aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, and aggravated burglary, all with prior calculation and design specifications. She was sentenced to death on June 21, 2003. She became the only woman on death row in the state of Ohio, a distinction she has held for over 2 decades. What followed was one of the most prolonged and procedurally complex sentencing histories in Ohio capital case records. The Ohio Supreme Court sent her case back to the trial court twice on procedural grounds, once due to an improper ex parte communication between the sentencing judge and the prosecutor in drafting the sentencing opinion, and once because the trial court had failed to consider Roberts' allocution during resentencing. Each time, the trial court reimposed the death penalty. The Ohio Supreme Court ultimately affirmed her death sentence in 2017. A federal district court denied her habeas corpus petition in 2024, reviewing 15 separate grounds for relief and finding none meritorious. Roberts, now 79 years old, remains the only woman on death row in Ohio. An execution date of August 12, 2020 was set and subsequently stayed. As of the time of this documentary, no new execution date has been scheduled. She continues to appeal. Robert Fingerhut, who was shot multiple times in his own kitchen on the night of December 11, 2001, has been dead for over 23 years. And now, before this documentary closes, there is something that the cumulative evidence of all 7 of these cases reveals. Something that prosecutors, criminologists, and death penalty researchers have noted in the documented record. Something that most people watching cases like these never hear. What most people don't know is this: of the 7 women featured in this documentary, not one has been executed. Cynthia Coffman has been on death row in California for over 35 years. Christa Pike has been on death row in Tennessee for over 30 years, with an execution date now scheduled. Lafonda Foster has spent nearly 4 decades in the Kentucky prison system. Robin Lee Rowe has been on death row in Idaho for over 30 years. Shawna Forde has been on death row in Arizona since 2011. Emilia Carr had her sentence reduced to life after a Supreme Court ruling that had nothing to do with her guilt. And Donna Kay Roberts, at 79 years old, remains the only woman on death row in the entire state of Ohio. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, no woman has been executed in the United States since 2023. The execution of women in America is extraordinarily rare, Fewer than 20 women have been executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. The cases documented in this film represent something the system imposed and then, in almost every instance, declined to carry out. The sentences were handed down. The cells were assigned. The decades began to pass. And the question that legal scholars, victim advocates, and criminal justice researchers continue to ask is the same question that the families of the victims in these cases have been asking for years. What does a death sentence mean when it is never carried out? Cynthia Coffman was convicted of kidnapping, raping, and strangling 4 young women across California and Arizona. She remains in a cell in Chowchilla. Christa Pike tortured a classmate and kept a piece of her skull. She is scheduled for execution in September 2026. Lafonda Foster participated in the murder of 5 people, including a 14-year-old boy, in a single night. She is serving life in Kentucky. Robin Lee Rowe burned her husband and 2 children alive in their beds for insurance money she never collected. She remains in Boise. Shawna Forde organized the killing of a 9-year-old girl who begged for her life. She remains in Goodyear, Arizona. Emilia Carr helped suffocate a 26-year-old mother in a field and is alive in a Florida correctional facility. And Donna Kay Roberts, who wrote the letters and bought the gloves and made the calls, is 79 years old and still filing appeals in Trumbull County. The victims in these cases do not file appeals. They do not grow older. They are not subject to Supreme Court rulings or procedural reversals or stays of execution. What the documented record of these 7 cases ultimately reveals is the gap between what the justice system says and what the justice system does, and the families left to live inside that gap for decades while the system decides what it actually means by the word final. If this documentary raised questions you want to go deeper on, our next film examines the men who share the same condemned units, and the cases that push the American justice system to its absolute limits. That story is next.